walk slowly to allow people to come. They're still coming down the lane. I'm Mark Johnson. I'm the Executive Director of the Center and Library of Environment and Social Justice, an asset of the Community of Living Traditions in the Stony Center. I hope that while you are with us, you have a chance to walk through as well. Testing, is that better? And we're and we're co-sponsors of this evening's event. This is a negotiated appearance, the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which has a prominent thread in this story, is also one of the sponsoring organizations. And, we're grateful that this fits into the agenda of the National Community of this Fellowship. And I said in a review of the book that I posted just a few days ago that having spent most of my life trying to make a business out of a conference subject, that's principal purpose was retreats. I can't think of a better way to sort of break business and reflect on what brings a group to a retreat experience like this. So Gordon Oyer is the author and the investigator and the archivist and the interpreter. He wears many different hats in pursuing the spiritual roots of protest. The book is available for those who are intrigued by the presentation and conversation in the back afterwards for a discount of $20 a copy. There are microphones throughout the room, not only for purposes of getting people involved in asking them questions, but we're also live streaming this presentation. I guess this is going to members of the National Committee who were unable to be here. And I don't know how much of the rest of the world has access to the live stream. Gordon is a historian by training. He has worked for some time for the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana in its business department, and brought obviously an avocational interest in this wonderful story to the work itself. We share, all of us here, a beneficial relationship with Chet Myers, who is referenced in the credits for having been supportive of Gordon's work as well. And as you know, Chet is on the board of the Center Library for Environment and Social Justice. I don't want to take any of the story away from the storyteller's purview, but I think you will come away with a good sense of this. And I really do mean one of the fascinating things about it is the way in which the research was done to uncover what in hindsight is clearly a critical weekend of 13 very important peacemakers at a very critical time in history. And one can't have watched and ask the questions that we ask of the role of technology and surveillance in our lives today without appreciating the precious that Thomas Merton and his friend Lynn Ferry and their exposure to Dr. Who gave them. These are old questions. And we will have an opportunity for questions and answers when we're done. We also want to lift up to your attention that there are flyers for the next joint event in our work at Stony Point Center, CLDSJ, Community Living Traditions, which is some time with Walter Bergman, Rabbi Nathan, Wordman, and Roman Gottwald at the beginning of November, beginning of October. So Gordon, thank you so much for the long drive out from Illinois. Thanks for making this a stop on your book tour. And thank you for being with us this evening. Please welcome Gordon Oyer.
Well, thanks very much, Mark, and thanks for all of you for coming out tonight to spend the evening with us and to look at this story. I'm here, as Mark said, mostly as a historian of this event. I'm not exactly an experienced activist who can personally regale you with tales of my interests as an activist.
Excuse me, could you speak up a little bit?
Sure, let me try to move this a little closer. Is this better?
Yeah.
Okay.
You can put it up a little higher if you need it.
Okay.
Other way, other way. Sweetie?
How's that? Is that okay?
Much better.
Okay. What I want to try to do tonight is a couple things. One is to just sort of commemorate the event itself by telling a little bit about what happened at the event. It was in 1964 at the Abbey of Gethsemane. And then the other part is to talk to you about some of the ideas that they talked about. And what I'm really hoping, I'll try to move fairly quickly through my part to give plenty of time for you folks to participate. But for as folks who have engaged in protests and engaged in pursuit dissent, I'm eager to hear back from you how these ideas from 50 years ago connect or don't connect with 2014. What sorts of things were, if we were going to get these folks together again today and have a similar conversation, what else would we need to talk about? Those kinds of things. So I hope you'll be thinking about those kinds of things as we go through this. The participants, there were actually 14 in total, 13 plus Thomas Merton, and there were 9 Catholics and there were 5 Protestants. And that fact in itself, in 1964, was actually one of the more significant aspects of the event. That is, there were Protestants and Catholics getting together to talk and to discuss these kinds of questions of faith. That was unusual for 64. And to quickly go through who these folks were, you probably know several of these folks. Dan Berrigan, the Jesuit priest, and his brother Philip Berrigan, Thomas Merton, who was the host at his abbey, two people with Catholic worker connections, Tom Purnell, Jim Forrest. The man down here in the lower left was a man named Tony Walsh. He was a Canadian. He was a friend of Daniel Berrigan. He ran a hospitality house in Montreal, Canada. He was Canadian. The next man is John Peter Grady. He was a lay Catholic. He was an activist from New York. He later would play a pretty significant role in planning draft board raids. But at this point in time, I don't think his activism was that great. And then the last two were stigmatine priests from Boston, Bob Kinane and a man named Charlie Wade. So those were the Catholics. The 5 Protestants who were there. First person in the upper left was Wilbur Ferry. He had a nickname of King, he went by the name King Ferry. He was the person who ran a think tank in Santa Barbara, California, called the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions or something like that. He was a personal friend of Thomas Merton, that's how he got invited. The person in the center is probably was the most famous Protestant there at that time. It's A.J. Musty, who had a long history with this movement, involvement in Fellowship of Reconciliation. He was very well respected, widely known as a man of high integrity and someone who held together different factions of the peace movement. On the right is a young John Howard Younger, a theologian before he became more well known for various reasons. This is the Presbyterian representative at the gathering, John Oliver Nelson. He had been teaching a seminary at Yale Divinity School for about 10 years. And during the 1964, he was making the transition from Yale to become the director of Kirkridge. He had helped found Kirkridge several years before. But in 1964, he was transitioning into actually becoming the director of Kirkridge. And he had a long involvement in these issues, conscientious objection. He was involved in the Fellowship of Reconciliation as well, board members.
Presbyterian Peace Fellowship.
The Presbyterian Peace Fellowship. The final Protestant was a man named Elbert Jean. is an interesting character. He just passed away just this past year. He was participating or representing a group called the Committee of Southern Churchmen, and their role was to minister in race reconciliation situations, intense race situations in the South. And their philosophy was that in those kind of situations, Southern white men were a lot more likely to actually be able to pursue reconciliation than Northern white folks who would come down and try to work in those situations. So that was sort of the mission. He worked with a man named Will Campbell. And as some of you may know, there were supposed to be two other Protestants that originally were going to participate. Martin Luther King originally was supposed to be here, but in 1964, he won the Nobel Peace Prize, and so that fall he had to prepare to go to Oslo to pick up his Peace Prize. And the other one was his aide and co-worker, Bayard Rustin. And Rustin was actually planning to be there until right the week of the event, and at the very last minute, changed his plans so he could come to Oslo. And when I tell that, I always say, if they actually would have attended, I wouldn't be talking to you today, somebody else would have written the book. That would have changed the whole dynamic of this event. A couple of other folks that are important to remember if we're going to commemorate the event. They weren't actually able to participate, but they played a role in planning the event for the event. First man is John Heidrich. He was the Interfaith Relations Director for Fellowship of Reconciliation. And he, in 1961, Martin had sort of determined that peace and nuclear disarmament was something that he really felt called to speak out on. And when he made that decision, he reached out to the FOR and offered to help the FOR in their work, in peace work. And in one of their conversations together, Heidrich and Merton raised the suggestion, maybe we could have a retreat out here and bring some leaders of the church to come out and talk about peace. And that was really the kernel of 1962. That was really the kernel of the event in 1964. The other person is a man named Paul Peachy. He was the executive secretary of an organization called the Church Peace Mission. And their role was to try to get together conferences and dialogues of mainstream theologians toward the pursuit of convincing mainstream Christianity that peace was really one of the callings of the broader church. That was sort of their mission. And these two interacted a lot together, worked together, and Heidrich shared this idea with Peachy, and they talked about what might happen. The first attempt was in 1963 to have something that would focus more on a CPM focus of getting some, various leaders, theologians out here who, as they said, were on the fence about peace to try to convince them. That never materialized, and so they had to try, or actually in 1964, Peachy sort of faded more into the background. He was still involved. He was the one who invited a couple of the people in 1964, but Heidrich really took the lead in 1964 to make this happen. So those are a couple of important folks to remember. The agenda for the gathering was something that Merton drew up, and he planned for 5 scheduled sessions: an opening session on Wednesday morning, and sort of an orientation, and then 4 sessions. One of each would be led by one of the participants, and they would give an impromptu discussion about presentation about something, and then lead a discussion about it. So Thomas Merton led on Wednesday afternoon. The topic of his presentation was called The Monastic Protest. Dan Berrigan was Thursday morning, and he mainly focused on the need of the Catholic Church to engage more with the world and be more into the spirit of the world, what was going on outside the Catholic Church. Thursday afternoon, Yoder gave a Protestant response to the first 3 sessions, and Friday morning, A.J. Muskie gave a summary of the state of the peace movement. We also had 2 masses, one Thursday morning and one Friday morning, and the rest of the time was mostly free time for them. wanted to show you a little bit about where they met. There were 3 of the sessions met in this facility, which was the gatehouse. It was the entryway, and there were rooms where monks would come and meet with their families. And so they used one of these rooms, and I sort of spliced together a couple of pictures to give you a view of what that room looked like. Where they met, and when they rained, this was right next to the retreat. That's where they stayed. So when it rained, this is where they met. When they could, the other 2 sessions, they walked a mile or so to Thomas Merton's Hermitage, which is pictured up here, and another picture of the interior. Masses and worship. The first Mass on Thursday morning was in a chapel that had been built for novices. It's this building right here. And then the second one was actually under this bell tower, and it's for what they call juniors, or advanced novices. And neither of these exist anymore. This is how it looks today, but they enclosed the front apse of the chapel to create a museum. And one of the more interesting stories from the event is associated with these masses, and that's because the abbot of the monastery made the pronouncement that if this group of Protestants is going to come in with these Catholics, one of the conditions for that is that they are not to participate in the Eucharist when they have Mass together. So that was an official pronouncement that they weren't able to do that. Merton had put Daniel Berrigan in charge of the Masses, and Berrigan was somebody who had given Mass, had given Eucharist to Protestants in the past, and he was very frustrated by that restriction. And this is the way the official story goes, is that what he did was he tried to compensate as best he could by making the Mass as informal as he could, and also he had Protestants on Thursday morning read Scripture. A.J. Muskie and John Nelson both read Scripture. And the way, supposedly he had informed the people that the Protestants couldn't take the Eucharist. Nobody really remembers him saying that, but that's what Berrigan says that happened. And but the thing was that his brother Philip, for some reason, came late and didn't hear that. And so when they participated in the Eucharist, when they were passing the elements, Philip took the elements and handed them to the Protestants in supposed ignorance, and so everybody participated in the Mass together after all, the Eucharist together after all. And it was one of the, in the memories of these folks, it was one of the more profound and moving occurrences that they would all participate together like that. There were strong memories of how powerful that was. The next day, Berrigan also pushed the boundaries by inviting John Howard Wheeler to give a homily on the Friday morning Mass. And now that was pushing the boundaries too. And the story also goes that the day before, Thomas Merton had actually asked King Ferry, who's a Unitarian, to give a homily. And in an interview, Ferry said as they were walking through the tunnels to the chapel, Merton got cold feet, and he said, you know, if the abbot ever heard that you could give it a homily, possibly a homily, there would be hell to pay. So you better do it. And Ferry said he worked all night to actually get this homily ready. But in the end, Merton gave a homily on Thursday morning, but then Friday morning, Dan Berrigan gave it to us. Free time, the rest of the time was free. Sometimes they would listen to the monks chant. And after the afternoon session on Wednesday, it's pretty dark, you can't see it, but somebody brought in some 6-packs of beer in the trunk of their car. And so after the Wednesday session, you can see this guy, he's holding a 6-pack, and there's a 6-pack in here sitting on the ground. So they had a good time. And Tom Cornell wrote up a little reminiscence of it back in 1964. I mean, 74. And I didn't put it in here, but basically he described how the Protestants were totally aghast at these Catholics running around drinking beer and looking up in such a holy setting. That was another interesting anecdote. So for the rest of the time, what I want to do then is turn more to some of the ideas. In the book, what I did was I sort of tried to do a chronological recounting of each of the sessions as it went, as best could be reconstructed from the notes that were available. What I want to do tonight, though, is to look at it a little more thematically, try to put in some themes. And one of the ways that it's helpful for me to think about it is when you think of the concept of spiritual roots of protest, there are a couple of kinds of roots. There are the roots that are uplifting, spiritual roots that are uplifting and empower us to act and to take acts of courage. There is also an element of spirituality or a spiritual root, whatever, that is what drives some of the evil in the world, some of the things that create the circumstances in which, for which we are actually called to protest. And so I want to look at it that way, this in terms of the spiritual roots of life, the ones that empower us, the ones that give us strength, and the spiritual roots of shadow, the ones that are driving those forces that we're protesting against. That's good. So first of all, one of the spiritual roots is one of the things I would put in the life categories is the concept of relationships, which, as I told the story of the Mass, that helped really connect the people and solidify some of the relationships that they had. And it wasn't something that they talked about, but it was something that they sort of acted out when they were there. And it was something that supposedly carried on beyond the retreat, and something that they could lean on in later years. When I was able to talk to Dan Bergen 50 years later, that was one of the things that he mentioned as being one of the most important things that he took away from that was the concept of friendship. And Bob Cunane, one of the priests in Boston, when he was reflecting on it, maybe a quote from him, these people had a view of life that I could partake of. It was kind of transformative, almost by osmosis. We had some heavy hitters in there, but they all acted as part of the group. Meeting all these great people gave me strength. My friendship with Jim Forrest and Tom Quinn started there. So that would be one thing, friendship. And I didn't make a slide for it, but I should also mention, and I'm not going to dwell on it, but they gave examples of nonviolence and where nonviolence would work in various situations. But it was sort of an assumption, my sense is it was sort of an assumption that was playing in the background that they brought to it, and my sense was that they didn't really discuss nonviolence a lot as a concept. But it was definitely a part of their conversation, and it would fall under the spiritual roots of what I would call the spiritual roots of life as well. Another idea that could maybe be put in that category is just it relates to our awareness. There are different kinds of awareness. Here I'm talking about our self-awareness, our awareness of ourselves, and our ability to reflect. And one of the ways that came out in the retreat was a question that Merton gave at the very opening session. He asked the question, by what right do we protest? What gives us the right to protest? And he asked them to think about that. And it was, as he described it, it was sort of a question sort of like a Zen poem, which is sort of like a parable or a story that's not really meant to have a clear answer. It's just something to get you to reflect. And it's something that they use as a teaching mechanism, supposedly, in Zen Buddhism, to, especially for newer folks, to help them to rely more on intuition, not so much on the logic. So that's the kind of question that was. It's something that they found helpful to reflect on. They didn't get very, as they shouldn't, they didn't give very clear answers, but they talked about it as sort of an instinct, something that we're called to do because we feel a spurring passion to do it. Another aspect of awareness, self-awareness, you could say, is contemplation. The interesting thing is Thomas Merton was known as known for contemplation, but they didn't really talk about it a lot. At the very end, it came up. He had put it in his handout that we would beginning of the orientation session, something they might talk about. But they didn't really talk a lot about it. You can throw that in the same category. There's another kind of awareness that I think can be thrown into this category. And this is sort of the shadow and light sort of brought up with each other maybe. But the idea of being aware of those forces of shadow. Okay. If we're not aware of them, if we don't understand them, then we're not going to be able to really address them in a very healthy, faithful, productive way. So becoming aware of those shadow elements is something that we need to cultivate. And the way that they talked about it at the retreat, the primary way that they talked about cultivating it at the retreat had to do with our social location, where we place ourselves socially. And they said the way that we get in touch with those forces of shadow is by consciously making choices to place ourselves at the margins, economically, socially, politically, whatever, at the margins. That came through, let's see. Oh, yeah, one of the examples where that was sort of expressed was in one of the conversations they were talking about. Somebody made the comment that, this was 1964, Freedom Summer had just occurred that past summer. And somebody made the comment, for Freedom Summer, maybe instead of just having white folks go down there and work a while to expand their horizons and then coming back, maybe white folks should go down there and actually live there and raise their kids there. And the quote was, care enough about it to give it the flesh. So that was sort of one example of how that sentiment came through in the conversation. Oyer talked about how the church is something that embodies an alternative to our surrounding culture, and that we should be maintaining a sense of otherness from the wider culture. Martin, for his part, he named what he called the real root, or the primary root of protest as being, and this is probably funny, identification with the underprivileged and dedication to their universe as a So that for him became the real root, is our ability to identify with those who are privileged. And then he went on to name inadequate roots by saying that inadequate roots are the official policy of any church or party in our stability to orthodoxy. So that's it. Those are inadequate roots, according to him. Part of seeking awareness of the shadow roots of the social movements also sort of involves an awareness of what doing that is going to require of us. And things like risk, vulnerability, relinquishing our social privilege, taking a posture of substitution over some of the things that they talked about as things that we're going to have to face if we're going to do that. Along these lines, that might fit into this. A.J. Muskie named the need for Americans to confront their own self-righteousness, misplaced assumptions about their role in the world, and he called on nations to assume a posture that liberated them from the falsehoods of human politics, and instead seek insights from other people. Back to Martin again, he said that in order to tap into that real root of protest, which was an indication of inability, we need to refuse our own privilege and protest against the arrogance and stupidity of the privilege. As far as the idea of a position of substitution, this is sort of more of a mystical concept that Merton brought in through his reading of this man who's named Louis Massimilian. And what he was talking about there is the idea that we enter into these situations sort of as a surrogate where we are entering them on behalf of both the oppressor and the oppressed, and sort of trying to reconcile that through our actions. And that's how Merton sort of applied it. Let's see. in addition to that idea of substitution, was Yoder's idea of the cross, suffering on the cross as a consequence of a potential consequence of placing ourselves in those positions. And Tom Cornell, when he wrote it up, I was going to read a book for him, he said that he brought a relevance to the theology of the cross that lives today. This is what salvation is about. You don't have to think about the afterlife very much, but think of it in terms of human life here on earth. How are we going to save ourselves from blowing ourselves up? Except by forgiveness and being willing to accept suffering, whether imposed or not. Those are some of the heavier ideas that are a little bit hard to explain. Another area where light and shadow sort of intersect to a certain degree is the idea of hope and despair. Really intertwined. Martin the Contemplative, for him, a sense of despair in our own power and control, he felt in reality could actually be the origin of a source of hope. We get to the place where we have to rely on the movement of God instead of the movement of ourselves. We move through that sense of despair. In his comments, Yoder talked about hope in the sense of looking for signs around us, looking for ways that we can see hope, where evidence of hope that we can look to, evidence of God's movement that we can look to as signs of hope. And he had three categories for that he used biblical terms for. There were portents, which he said were signs in which the end result was manifested in the act itself. And he gave the example of hospitals, where hospitals were something that were started by churches, and but the society took them over, and so they were something that perpetuated throughout society because the church began them. So that's a sign of hope that the church can do things that society will adopt and move forward for the benefit of all. He talked about marvels, miracles, and wonders. There are happenings he said that astound us and provide unpredictable results. And the example that he gave was the lunch counter protest in 1960. Started very small, but soon spread far and wide and became the source of a force for change for immigration in businesses in the South and the formation of SNCC. So that was something that was few people sitting down in lunch counter just sort of exploded. That was his example of a marvel or a wonder. The last one, springs in the desert. They were the servicing of good things that build up underground and are unseen. And when they appear, they confound us because we don't know where they came from. We don't understand the logic of where they actually came from. So people saw the water building up or flowing from the mountainside, and never expected it to spring up later in the desert. Sort of the imagery. The example he gave there was the recent civil rights gains that were happening in the 60s, which he said relied on the silent but dedicated work of people like George Washington Carver, Ralph Bunche, and other people of the past century that he felt helped set the stage for the civil rights movement. Okay, turning to the shadow side, fully to the shadow side. When Martin was reading Louis Massillon, one of the things that he picked up on was Massillon's idea of privilege. And he talked about privilege in two senses, social privilege and spiritual privilege. And he invoked the idea of, and that those two are very different and sort of opposites. So he invoked the idea, biblical idea, that last shall be first and first shall be last. And also he said there was a biblical dialectic in which it was the stranger, the underprivileged, the younger son, the one who has not, who comes with the message of the love of God. It was the one without the social status that brought the love of God. And he said that to hold holding on to our social privilege is something that brings us under God's judgments if we cling to our social privilege. And what that does when we cling to our social privilege is that uses the word fossilizes us, it hardens it, makes us blind. And once we become fossilized or hardened, then it becomes very hard for us to actually hear the voice of God that is coming from where it is coming from. And it wasn't just an individual thing that picked up on the idea of privileged collectivities or institutions. He said that they stand in the way not by warfare, but by abuse of the privileges that they have. He said we cannot rely, this is Merton speaking, we cannot rely on the witness of a privileged collectivity comprised of us who are white and prosperous and assume we've got the right religion. We suffer from the illusion that we have everything to give and nothing to receive. In reality, the Negro is offering us salvation, we're not offering it. In his presentation, another idea, oops. In his presentation, Yoder brought up the idea of principalities and powers, which is familiar with a lot of us. And he referenced a book that he had just published by a Dutch theologian named Berkhoff. And after World War II, Berkhoff and others were struggling with how to deal with the horrendous violence and evil that had happened in the 20th century. And they returned to the idea of principalities and powers, which have been pretty much discredited increasingly since the Renaissance and the Enlightenment era as something that was more of a superstition. But after World War II, trying to account for that evil, the ideas of principalities and powers made more sense. And they framed it more in terms of institutional and structural systems that drive those forces of evil. And one of the main applications of that concept of principalities and powers was technology, as an example of principalities and powers. Both Merton and Ferry had recently read a book by this guy, Jacques Ellul, The Technological Society. And they were very excited about what that book had to say. And so they brought those ideas with them, and they wrote it throughout the whole time. They wrote the topic of technology came up. And it was not so much, the idea was not so much specific technologies in themselves, but it's more what the French term technique, which is more of a social process. And it is something that thrives on efficiency and productivity are its primary drivers. Technique is something that sort of compels us to perpetuate itself, and it instills the idea in us that if it can be done, it must be done. Our very ability to take the next step technologically, because we can do that, we feel compelled to do it in the name of efficiency, productivity, and progress. That's the mentality of technique, and we don't weigh that in terms of actual, what is this actually going to do for us? It's more like we just need to advance it. And at the retreat, they discussed how this mentality permeated all aspects of our lives. They agreed that it diminished rather than enhanced our humanity and our ability to function as free individuals. And they especially saw it work in the logic of military establishment and tactics and weaponry. And then finally, one of the ideas and concepts that they talked about, they didn't name the idea of mass culture so much as one of these powers constructions, but it fits pretty well with it, I think. And the role of mass culture was something that Thomas Merton was especially sensitive to and concerned about. And he made the comment that warning us against becoming what he said was Christians in the Kierkegaardian sense. It took me a while to figure out what more we meant by that, but there's an essay that he wrote the following year that sort of explains a little bit more about what he meant by that. The philosopher Soren Kierkegaard described a social process that leads individuals to advocate personal responsibility and advocate their personal choices. And as he said, as Martin said, yield themselves to the joy of being part of a pure myth. So we give up our individuality and just sort of plug into what's out there to get our identity. He said in doing so, they had surrendered into the public void, where they lost their human and religious integrity. And when having lost their integrity, they lost their capacity to resist or protest against those forces to which they had surrendered. In his 1966 book, Raids on the Unspeakable, he invoked this idea, this Kierkegaard, about the process of social leveling, through which one belongs to what he said was absolutism of the world of managers and military class. He defined the unspeakable as the void we encounter underlying the announced programs and universal aspirations for the best of all possible worlds. The void that gets into the language of public and official declarations at the very moment they are pronounced and makes them ring dead with the hollowness of ethos. Christian hope begins where every other hope stands frozen stiff before the face of the unspeakable, being back against the hope of the spirit. And he goes on to warn to say that although there definitely is goodness in the world, I'm not saying the world is totally bad, there's goodness in the world. But he says that those who at present are so eager to be reconciled with the world at any price must take care not to be reconciled with it under this particular aspect as the use of the unspeakable. And most of you probably are familiar with Jim Douglas's book, J.F.K. and Unspeakable, which borrowed from this idea of the unspeakable that Merton articulated to name the security state and the doctrine of plausible deniability as an example of that. So to close, and then hopefully get some of you to speak up and share some of your thoughts in response to this. What was the significance of the retreat? We cannot easily trace it from here to direct events that followed. They did not come here to plan a particular program of action and then go implement it. But because several of the participants continue to reference it over the years, we do know that it did leave at least an impression on those folks. And as I said, I think I said, meant to say at the beginning, that impression has continued throughout the conversation and the work of various pockets of the peace and development. So, it built significant relational bridges that transcended religious boundaries that many of them later come to draw on. It helped focus the imagery of principalities and powers in awareness of the technological society and its priorities, and that imagery and awareness became incorporated into the worldview of many who later resisted Vietnam nuclear weapons. Another important legacy of it is that it helped smooth the way to establish the Catholic Peace Fellowship. That was one of John Heinlein's main motives, was to help create a comfort level between FOR leadership, or within FOR leadership, or including Catholics as a branch of the FOR. And this Merton in general, and this event in particular, helped pay for that. And the Catholic Peace Fellowship is one of the main reasons why during the Vietnam War, the Catholic Church provided the largest number of pensions and things of any religious group. Perhaps the greatest significance is as an iconic model for gathering across faith boundaries to listen and learn and discuss and become more aware of the spiritual roots that call us to speak out against and resist the powers of the unspeakable. And so that's what I'm hoping we can do for a little bit, and hopefully you're still awake, and hopefully some ideas have occurred to you about how this may or may not fit or resonate with what goes on today. Before I do that, Before I do that, I wanted to put a plug in for this event, which is October 24, 25 at Bellarmine University is going to be a symposium on this topic. And Jim Forrest, Tom Cornell, and Bob Kinane are all going to be there for the panel to talk about it. Joe Grant of Just Faith Ministry is going to talk about reclaiming spirituality as a leader and have a panel discussion following that as well. John Deere, Jim Forrest, Tom Cornell are going to be there, and then there's going to be showing of the movie Hit Stay, which is about the draft work race. So with that said, does anybody have any thoughts they'd like to share, questions asked? Yes.
Let's share one microphone because I don't think the other one. I apologize for the fuzziness in the system. I'm not sure what's going on. This will work with response.
What wasn't covered? Maybe that's.
Let me make a couple of observations and questions. The observation about that, I guess it was about Kuhn, about being amongst the elite in some ways, the rising, and yet the sense of being welcome at all levels. One of the things that struck me is this is the week that Merton's book Seeds of Destruction came out, and he got a book from his publisher, and he signed copies for everyone and handed them out. And in the telling of it, you do see a little bit of that difference between Merton and others, but still it is displayed as very much a community, and community being maybe something you want to speak to. The other is Gordon comes from someplace that I know a little bit about the University of Illinois, which in terms of a liberal and technology zone is the heart of the beast. And it's interesting, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on how all of this fits into that environment. The academic university in terms of the shape of mass culture today, in terms of the response. I think you rightfully want to hear some of the reflections of the audience, and you and I might have another opportunity to reflect on those questions. But maybe if you want to respond a little bit, then give them some time to think.
Okay. Well, the first comment about the community, the seeds of destruction, that was one thing that Daniel very explicitly mentioned was that stuck in his mind was the memory of Merton very humbly and congenially doing that. The technology part, in my preface, I wrote that one of the consequences of researching and writing this book was a lot of cognitive dissonance, and you hit on one of the big areas of cognitive. I as an administrator, I am feeding the beast, so that's a tough question. For me, it's not even so much, I guess, the technology aspect of it, but working in a huge bureaucracy, and academic bureaucracies can sometimes be maybe a little more than others, but it's still a huge bureaucracy, it's impersonal. And the ways in which, even as Mark said, I work in the business office, this mentality of technique is everywhere. This drive for efficiency, decisions have to be made not based on what's good for human beings, not what's good for your coworkers so much. No, that's not what's good for the individuals, but it has to be made on what is going to make the organization run better. I guess I'm far enough removed from the actual development of the technology itself that I don't really, that's not really visible. But that aspect of technique certainly is, and it's something that I've always wrestled with. Okay.
Right after Sean.
Oh, okay. Gordon, I just finished the Jim Douglas book a few weeks ago, the JFK and the Unspeakable book, so this is really interesting to me. I didn't realize we're going to have these connections tonight, but I guess it's interesting to me because this symposium was, they had this retreat, this gathering was a year post-assassination. So this idea of unspeakable and Merton's role as a fellow Catholic with JFK, and then makes me think a lot more about this gathering instead of a different way. But I think that book really teases out some of the pieces about what is unspeakable and what's the theological work for us today in the medical community for unpacking what our unspeakable is, and is it the same unspeakable, or is it different, or is it just more of the same monster? So I'd just be curious what some of your thoughts are on unspeakable today.
Well, I think it's certainly a continuation of what was going on back then. I think it's gotten a lot, personally, a lot worse, I guess. I think the service, the whole surveillance question and the whole privacy question, I think the way that we've gone about the Gulf War renditions a long time ago, I mean, those are all examples of the unspeakable applying itself today, I guess. I probably, I don't know if I can teach you more of that question. But yeah, I think that's something that we all are sort of called to think about is how is that maybe just today in the world around us? How can we mean it? How can we identify it? How can we deal with it?
Similar question perhaps, but in terms of response of having a gathering like this and an intentional reflection like this, are there any parallels of that kind of activity recently, say in the current decade?
Yeah, that's a good question. Some of you folks are more plugged into the organizational flow of the peace movement, might be able to answer that. I don't know. I guess the question I would have, one of the things that was groundbreaking was the Catholic Protestant interaction. So how would that kind of ecumenism look like today that are breaking boundaries in the same way that they were breaking boundaries back then with the players of that conversation?
And let me mention coming over to me. I ran a conference center for 20 years in the Adirondacks, and part of the history of that was the role of the conference centers in the YMCA to bring together this kind of leadership from the turn of the last century, from the early part of the century. And at exactly the time that this was convening, there were efforts, for example, at FOR in Nyack and at these conference centers to bring blacks and whites into a conversation about race in America at the highest levels. And so that was happening in the face of some resistance in terms of operating what was going on. And then the other thing to think about is, the demonization of Iran over the last 10 years has at the same time been a period when at the very highest levels, people with governmental experience in Iran and the United States are meeting in Sweden and other places. People are coming together more in terms of diplomacy than in terms of teasing out the ideas, but the idea of convening people in conversations has many analogies.
I think my question is, I was surprised one of the spiritual roots of life or the spiritual life was something like social location or relocating yourself. And a couple of figures in that gathering are not the kind of people that I see as people who relocated themselves socially, murdered themselves, and maybe there were obviously some activists in that circle. So was there some kind of dialogue that happened about the role of the intellectual and the role of the activist? I don't know what the Verdes at that point had become as thrown into the public activism at the point of this gathering, or if they were more, I don't know. But it just seems like a strange thing for them to be the first. One of the things that they thought about was social location, and I don't connect that with some of those figures.
Well, that was an idea that was discussed, and it was mostly Merton's brought that up, and he saw himself as his role as a monk in a monastery. He saw himself as a marginal person, that he had removed himself from the center of society. So he saw his location in the monastery as marginal. But again, it was something that was brought up as a concept. It wasn't like they all had a
consensus, yeah, we all need to go through this.
Or even the relationship between the two, so how they interact, intellectual role, movements, and social.
Yeah, that, no, that, in the notes, that kind of program. Well, you folks are the experts in this, you're the practitioners, and sort of hoping that you could share, you know, if I were convening this today, I'd add this to the list because that's something that really needs to be talked about in the context of spiritualism. Okay. Does anybody have any thoughts like that?
In many ways, all those men do this. One of the things came out of that. Berrigan credits his 68 cadence book to his movement around this and his conversations with Bill. King Ferry was here in Westchester and financed the Westchester People's Action Coalition. And Ping and Sharon were very, very active in that whole movement. You know, we're fighting for the right and a whole number of people from the 60s to the 80s and even to things there. Ping provided the American well, a number of expeditions in South Pacific. So their influence out of there, you know, talking about and how it helped him in his understanding of what he was doing with the other Senate Democratic States.
Yeah, and I think it was pretty much intangible in a lot of ways. When they talked to Tom Cornell, he basically said it didn't, you know, nobody really, he didn't feel like he did anything different because of it. He was already deeply enmeshed in the Catholic work movement. But there are other people like Bob Canadian, who formed the event. So it depends on the individual, I think.
The other thing that came out of that was FOR brought together representatives from the Peace Fellowship in 1982. We met at Kirkwood. Bill Stringfellow led us in our Bible study, and we were planning the Witness for Peace. It was right after the first 125 o'clock, and we gathered at Kirkwood to make that permanent Witness for Peace in Colombia. And we had the leadership of the Peace Fellowships. And I remember talking about many of them, and John Oliver Nelson was one of the two people who was in our shadow study. It was about 4 years ago, the Peace Fellowships met here at Stony Center with a similar kind of agenda, and out of which came, I think, 4 or 5 areas of engagement that were, because of the nature of that gathering, grounded in the question of spiritual roots. One would be around gun violence, and the caravan that went from San Diego to Washington, D.C. I think that's something that grew out of that conversation. Some of the work with refugee camps in West Bank and Palestine grew out of that. There were 4 or 5. And it was interesting in a similar way that was about 24 of the Peace Fellowships suddenly discovering that there were 4 or 5 items that were commonly grounded in the work of those Peace Fellowships, but there hadn't been a conversation about beyond the Iraq War.
What about that?
Well, I would just wonder if the community of living traditions here is not in the same sphere as that symposium was in terms of being ecumenical. This is a faith that I think that is a model that is looking to grow as well. And the no drones work being done, particularly in Syracuse, are by the will of Grady and some of his children. So the notion of sort of passing from generation to generation
Frida Berrigan has just written a book where she rehearses the way some of this, I think, experience impacts her life today, because was with the house, her mom and dad raised her in this environment. You know?
I guess one connection I would make is last weekend we were at a Midwest Catholic River gathering, and the way you describe in this narrative the impact of the Mass as maybe being one of the more significant moments is interesting to me, because this last weekend we were through the roundtable discussions, and there's always been this tension within the Catholic River gathering as it's gotten more ecumenical and more interfaith. About it has Catholic roots, and yet when we come for worship, there's a lot of tension around issues related to priests, but also just is this a mass we're serving? The kind of traditional, funny conversations you don't expect to have among a bunch of radicals. And we had this roundtable discussion, and people were it was an impassioned discussion. It was a healthy debate. Here are some Catholic workers saying, because we share the responsibility for organizing these worship services. So we didn't have, and so I'm a Protestant in the Catholic worker. And we had hosted some gatherings, and I hear in this roundtable that people were uncomfortable with my presence, and with it not being, we never claimed it to be a mass, but with it not being a mass, so they went to a local mass instead of coming to the Catholic gathering. Just these really interesting conversations that seem a little throwback, but yet are important. I think they're essential, but strange that we can talk about these very intense issues as people of faith out there sometimes, but then the struggles that we continue to have internally don't sound that much different, and yet it's maybe one of the more substantial moments we can have together as communities is to be more open about the big questions and create the kind of meaning that maybe they experience in this event.
Right at the end of the presentation, you asked us, in these kinds of gatherings of period of time, what sorts of things would we imagine we need to do that would be transgressive in a similar way that these people were breaking boundaries or crossing boundaries by gathering together with some Catholics. And my immediate thought, which wasn't really an answer to that question, but what prompted was maybe an inverse of that question, because one of the things that stands out to me looking at this gathering is that it's all white men. Right? And we can easily make excuses for it, saying it's part of its time period. And although, of course, right in that period of time, there's a great deal of racial tension in the rest of our country. So I wonder if they were sensitive to that aspect of the gathering, or whether it just seems completely natural to them. And what that makes me wonder about our gatherings is, even when we think we're being transgressive, we're doing something radical. What are we blind to that we don't see that, a couple of decades down the road, they're going to look back at pictures of us having had these radical gatherings and think, wow, how did they not notice that obvious gap in there?
Well, the quick excuse I would make was that King and the rest of them were supposed to be there. And if it would have played out, they would have listened to people of color there. And the other excuse I would give would be that this was at a monastery, at a retreat house that didn't allow women. So they really couldn't include women for an overnight event like that. That's a bad thing. Not until 1980. So that would be the excuse. But that's a great point. They talked a lot about race in general. I think they were, one of the things that Bob Community mentioned was, that really impressed him was, I think it was Ferry and Merton had a conversation about race that really impressed him in the sense that he felt like they really got it in a way that he wouldn't have. They educated him on some of the underlying issues, race. So I think they were sensitive to that. And some of them were anyway. But yeah, I mean, 14 one day, so.
I remember, I was living through those times, and it never occurred to me that spiritual roots only go back to 1964. When I think about what was happening in '64, it was student protests in Berkeley and Yale and Freedom Summer. That's what was going on then. Were these guys just talking about it in their heads?
Well, one of the things that was going on, yeah, these protests were going on, but they had sort of ambivalence of how do we fit in as people of faith? Because they saw all this stuff that wasn't faith-based. And they said, we're people of faith, so how does this fit in our role as people of faith? And that was one of the things that we figured out. It wasn't the idea that there was, that they were inventing protest or anything like that. It was that they, again, in 1964, that there was this stuff going on that they didn't quite know how to relate to. And so that's what they're trying to figure out. How do we relate to that? How do we connect with this as a part of our spirituality?
But the March on Washington was in 1994, in '63. And I always thought of that as spiritual.
Well, sure, there was spirituality about it. There's no question about that. I think it wasn't necessarily organized as a religious event. And I think there was still, I come from the Mennonite tradition, so especially in, I know Paul Petrie started with this, but the idea that this idea of sort of separation, the idea of especially an idea of peace that was they use the word non-resistance, that you don't make waves. And so for people like that, even the March on Washington, I think they would probably be a struggle. Although, it's kind of peaceful, so I don't know if you would have a problem with that. But yeah, it was just an uncertainty of how to, again, they were just trying to come to terms with it. It wasn't that they thought that they were really inventing anything, they were just coming to the topic.
In reflecting on the 14 white guys, I look at what's happening at Bellarmine in a month, and I see 5 white guys doing this. And it just really kind of strikes me that the table hasn't changed much in 50 years with something like that. For me, really.
But there's a woman or two on the afternoon. Well, yeah, sorry, that's my fault. That's not their fault. That's my fault. I named the 3 people who were at the retreat, and then he's giving an hour keynote address. But the panel discussion, sorry, I apologize.
In our church in Michigan, we spent 3 big sessions discussing a great document, 25 pages, written by a Pope, who said some incredible things. He was, I think, breaking the ground not only the relationship between Catholics and Protestants, but between Christians and Muslims and Jews, and talking about his understanding of the opportunities for all people to find favor with God and opens and raising the doors, I think. That's how that relates to the things that you choose.
Thanks. I haven't, yeah. The Pope we've got, I think, is a pretty impressive guy. Really impressive. Appreciate this perspective.
A number of us here, and maybe many of you, were involved in organizing the People's Climate March last Sunday. And the critique that has begun to follow on that event in terms of who was in the room or which room when the plan was going on is fascinating in its own right. But the fact that the faith-based, the spiritual roots of being engaged in that movement was sort of farmed out to green faith, and that one block was sort of set aside for the spiritual community to fall into the larger march was fascinating. And part of that seems to me to have to do with which identity do I bring to the streets when I move into the streets? Is it the community of faith that I'm a part of, or some other of consumption that I'm a part of, or militarism that I'm a part of? And when you think, who might you invite today to this kind of, might be a Medea Benjamin and Ann White and a Noam Chomsky and Chris Hedges. So the players at the table might come from different backgrounds. I read the study to suggest that these people were asking a really deep question about how do we know that it's the warrant of God that undergirds our faith? How do we know it's not ego or culture or something else? And it seems to me that that's often a deeper question and a harder question to answer as well. So they weren't there to find out, well, now I go back in the streets, I'll be more clear about this. It was asking what they were called to do.
Yeah, thanks for that.
My question is, what did they disagree about? I mean, it sounds, the way you presented it, sounds as if they were kind of one big happy family, but frankly, I've never been in a community of peace activists, church-based or otherwise, that doesn't have strong disagreement and have to figure out how to negotiate conflict. So was that going on? Was there an underlying text that was about conflict too?
Well, the only thing I could get people to talk to say in terms of the relationships was that it was very respectful. It sounded like that there were disagreements of perspective. I think especially when they were talking about this idea of the underprivileged and people, what they call under dereliction. Not everybody bought that. So it's not like they were all in harmony in terms of, yeah, we all agree with that. But they didn't seem to yell at each other much. There was respectful disagreement was the sense that I looked at. So is that your experience with most peace groups? Respectful disagreement?
No.
Well, and you have the young Tom Cornell reflecting, saying, oh, there's a bunch of old white men who were just saying it was pretty dull and boring,
Right.
Except for Yoder's premise.
Right. Yoder was boring because I deal with it.
That's because it wasn't. And then you also had sort of the esteem of Muskie, who was really the only one in the room from the other end, from the end of his life, in terms of that, where everybody else was earlier, so Ron Deckers and Muskie.
He had one of those.
I'm glad to hear that they talked about privilege and saw themselves in a situation of privilege. Because that's the way it strikes me, that the black communities in the South, the churches, they were doing this thing. And these guys are just trying to figure out how to get into it. And they realized that that their privilege was a big problem and they had to learn how to deal with that.
That was an interest in that whole conversation. Again, that came out of Mervyn, and it came out of his reading of Louis Masson. The idea that the fact that that was a concept they were talking about, that sort of impressed me too, I guess, that they Googled it anyway. The idea of white privilege apparently didn't even know start to be written about a few years later.
In 1968 or 66, 67, 68, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference had a military which really identified with those marginalized in society. And of course, that was Martin Luther King Jr.'s venue for getting out front with the viruses and also was. And it seems to me that there is a real, a strong sense in the Black community that they were all marginalized and they need to perhaps identify even those who were the most marginalized. So,
yeah, I am not sure quite how to connect to this, but I see it, it's also much space.
Thank you very much for coming. I just want to say that it was unfortunate that Dr. King and his associate weren't there. It would have definitely added an extra dimension to probably what would have turned out.
It would have been very different.
Yes, definitely. I can only speak from my experience. I'm from the Muslim part of the community here. Last week, for the Green Faith March, we had a few Muslim leaders come together for the march at the UN last week. And I was fortunate enough to meet the son of Lord Muhammad II, who was known as America's Imam. He was a prominent African-American Imam out of Chicago, where he rests in peace. And I met with his son, and it was very interesting to have a dialogue. I'm Shiite from the Middle East, and he is a legacy of the African-American. He's the grandson of Elijah Muhammad, the founder of the Nation of Islam. He's mainstream now. So I could definitely see the difference. The topic of privilege, quote unquote, came up also. And we had this lovely, actually, comical discussion talking about, the white Muslim, Islamophobia is, you guys don't know what it's like to be, you laugh at that term, we've been stoned and we've been yelled at and we've been kicked around. It's like, how about privilege? And then when I thought about it, I was like, no, you're right. A lot of us are snobby Arabs or Indian packs that come here on planes with student visas that have come from very privileged backgrounds in the Middle East. The minute somebody laughs at us, we coin the term Islamophobia. So I can see in every community how there is a difference, whether it's Catholic, whether it's Protestant, whether it's white, whether it's Black. And it was just a really eye-opening discussion that the topic of privilege has migrated even over to the Muslim community.
Yes.
Well, there's food in the back, so everyone won't rush out. They'll have a snack. The book is available. I want to say, as a reader, I thought you did a good job explaining the book, but there's so much more there. Your reference to Louis Massignon and Jacques Ellul. The thing that the book does after it does its detective work and discovers and resurrects and reconstructs this event almost like a play in 4 acts, is then it explores, as Gordon invited us to do today, themes that can't help but to have some of today in them, the way they're unfolded. So there's a theological set of threads in here, and it's even richer than what must have happened in Gethsemane, rich enough in its own right. So again, that's my endorsement to encourage you to pick up the book. It is a good read, but it's also a challenging book in thought. So Gordon, thank you so much for coming. Thank you.
Thanks so much for these communities. Why don't we meet at 9 o'clock and make our worship, our closing worship for the day. So half an hour.